All right, so get this. Before 1870, only about 10% of Africa was under European control.
Right.
But by 1914,
Yeah.
almost 90%.
It's crazy.
That's a huge GE land grab in just a few decades.
Yeah.
So today we're deep diving into this pivotal period,
Yeah.
the Scramble for Africa, using excerpts from a fascinating academic article of the same name.
Okay.
And you'll uncover not just the what,
Right.
but the why behind this historical whirlwind,
Yeah.
with some surprising facts along the way.
Cool.
I mean, it's just mind-boggling how quickly the map of Africa was redrawn.
Yeah, it really is. Like,
Someone blinked and an entire continent changed hands.
yeah, someone blinked and boom, it's like all these different colors on the map.
That's it.
It's wild.
So what were the key factors that allowed European powers to gain control so rapidly?
Well, technology played a huge role.
Okay.
Like, think about steamships navigating rivers like the Nile,
Right.
opening up the interior in ways never before possible.
Makes sense.
And railways crisscrossing the landscape,
Yeah.
facilitating the movement of troops and resources.
Okay.
It's almost like someone laid down, like, a super highway for colonization.
So it wasn't just about brute force.
Yeah.
It was also about harnessing new technologies to their advantage.
Exactly.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And what about,
Oh, and we can't forget
yeah.
the telegraph.
Oh, right, yeah.
Suddenly, information was zipping back and forth between Europe and Africa
Right.
at lightning speed,
Yeah.
like real-time decision-making and control.
I mean, that's
it was
huge.
huge impact.
I hadn't really thought about
Yeah,
how the speed of communication could influence the pace of colonization.
right. It's crazy, like
Yeah.
having instant messaging for empires.
Basically.
Yeah.
So was there anything else? What about
Oh, and perhaps the most overlooked technological advancement was quinine.
quinine, right?
Before quinine, malaria was a death sentence for many Europeans venturing into Africa.
Right.
But with this new treatment, suddenly vast swaths of the continent became accessible.
Wait, so a little pill
Yeah, crazy, right?
essentially paved the way for a massive land grab. It's
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah.
It's almost like a modern day antibiotic,
Yeah.
revolutionizing our ability to fight disease
Hmm.
and indirectly shaping global events.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It really is.
Now, while these advancements made Africa more accessible,
Right.
the motives for the scramble ran much deeper than just grabbing land.
Right, because the usual story is that Europeans saw Africa
Right.
primarily as a source of raw materials to fuel their industrial revolutions.
Right.
Ivory, rubber, diamonds, the whole treasure chest.
Yeah, all of it. Yeah.
Right.
There's truth to that, but the article challenges us to go beyond this,
Okay.
the simplistic view.
Okay.
So think about it.
Like,
Europe was undergoing major economic shifts. Markets were shrinking.
yeah.
Investors were desperately seeking new opportunities for their capital.
Right.
Africa, with its vast resources and untapped markets, seemed like the perfect solution.
So it was less about stealing resources and more about securing new markets and investment opportunities
Exactly.
to boost their economies.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that makes sense.
It was a calculated move driven by economic necessity as much as anything else.
Okay, so what about,
Oh,
and were there also strategic reasons
yes, absolutely.
for wanting to control Africa?
Yes,
I mean, it's a pretty important piece of real estate, geographically speaking.
absolutely.
Right.
Control of key waterways, like the Suez Canal,
Yes.
became vital for projecting power globally.
Right.
Imagine controlling this crucial trade route, connecting Europe to Asia.
Yeah, that would be,
It was a strategic imperative for any nation with global ambitions.
makes sense.
And let's not forget the establishment of naval bases along the African coast,
Right.
projecting military power across the oceans.
It's like they were playing a giant game of Risk with colonies as their pawns in the struggle for global dominance.
A very apt analogy.
Yeah.
But there was another, perhaps less tangible, motivation at play:
Oh,
national pride.
okay.
Having a vast empire became a symbol of prestige,
Right.
a way for nations to assert their dominance on the world stage.
So it wasn't just about economics and strategy.
Yeah.
There was also this element of ego,
Yeah,
of wanting to be seen as the biggest and baddest empire on the block.
exactly.
Okay.
And this is where the concept of the white man's burden comes in.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So many Europeans genuinely believed they were doing Africa a favor by colonizing it.
Really?
Yeah, they saw themselves as bringing civilization and Enlightenment
Wow.
to what they perceived as backward societies.
Wait, so they were actually using this idea of a burden
Yeah, it's pretty messed up.
to justify their actions?
Yeah.
That's messed up.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
But it was a widely held belief at the time.
Wow.
One prominent figure even wrote, and I quote,
Okay. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need.
Wow.
It's chilling.
Yeah, that's really something.
it is.
It makes you realize how deeply entrenched these ideas were.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a few individuals.
No.
It was an entire worldview
An entire worldview
that shaped their actions.
shaped their actions.
Wow.
And this worldview had devastating consequences for the people of Africa.
Right?
But before we delve into those,
Okay.
let's look at some of the key events that
Yeah.
unfolded during this tumultuous period.
Yeah, let's dive into the drama.
All right.
I'm ready for some historical intrigue.
Well, one story you can't ignore is that of the Congo Free State.
Okay.
It's a tale of greed, brutality, and exploitation.
Oh, yeah. King Leopold II of Belgium
Yes.
and his reign of terror.
Yes.
I've heard about the atrocities, but I'm always up for a good villain story.
Well, get this.
Okay.
Leopold, driven by an insatiable hunger for rubber, unleashed unimaginable horrors upon the Congolese people.
Right.
We're talking forced labor, mutilation, and mass killings.
Wow.
And it wasn't just a few isolated incidents.
Right.
It was systematic and widespread.
So how did he get away with it? Weren't other European powers paying attention?
It's a complex story.
Okay.
You see, Leopold was incredibly savvy at manipulating public perception.
Okay.
He presented himself as a benevolent philanthropist,
Uh-huh.
bringing progress to the Congo.
Right.
Meanwhile, behind the facade,
Well,
he was running a brutal extraction machine,
wow.
driven by profit,
Okay.
fueled by violence.
So it was all about PR and deception?
Yes.
He was essentially playing the international community
Uh-huh.
while lining his own pockets?
Mm-hmm.
That's cold-blooded.
Precisely.
That's a,
And took years for the truth to come out,
wow.
thanks to the brave efforts of journalists and activists
Right.
who risked their lives to expose the horrors of Leopold's regime.
Yeah, it's
It's a reminder
a good reminder.
that even in the midst of darkness, there are always those who fight for justice and truth.
Absolutely.
And while Leopold's Congo is a particularly egregious example,
Right.
it reflects a broader pattern of brutality and exploitation
Right.
that characterized much of the scramble for Africa.
Yeah, so while European leaders were busy carving up the continent,
Yes.
the people living in these newly claimed territories
Yes.
were facing unimaginable hardship and suffering.
That's the harsh reality.
It is.
And it's something we need to keep in mind
Yeah.
as we continue to explore
Absolutely.
this complex and often tragic period of history.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit.
What about the Berlin Conference?
Right. The Berlin Conference.
I know it's often seen as the official starting point of the scramble.
Okay.
Was it really just a bunch of diplomats
Yeah.
sitting around a table dividing up a continent like a pizza?
It kind of sounds like that.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the Berlin Conference, held from 1884 to 1885, was very real. It was a gathering of European powers,
Okay.
ostensibly aimed at establishing rules
Right.
for the orderly colonization of Africa.
Orderly.
I know.
That seems a bit ironic considering the chaos and brutality that ensued.
Yeah, very much so.
Right.
The conference was less about protecting the interests of Africans
Right.
and more about preventing a war between the European powers themselves.
Okay.
They were essentially setting up guidelines for how to divide the spoils
I see.
without stepping on each other's toes.
So it was more about avoiding a European free-for-all
Yeah, pretty much.
than about respecting the sovereignty of African nations.
Sadly, that's an accurate assessment.
Wow.
The Berlin Conference essentially codified the rules of the game,
Right.
a game where African people had no say and no agency.
It's like they were playing chess with human lives.
The stakes were incredibly high.
Right.
Tensions were already simmering between European powers.
Yeah.
And the competition for African territory only intensified those rivalries.
So the scramble for Africa wasn't just a continental affair.
No.
It was fueling a powder keg of global tensions.
Exactly.
And how did that...
Well, those tensions would eventually erupt
Right.
in a way that no one could have predicted World War I.
Hold on, are you saying
Yeah.
that the scramble for Africa actually contributed to the outbreak of World War I?
It's a complex story, but the competition for colonies,
Yeah.
the jostling for power,
right?
And the tangled web of alliances
Right.
that emerged from the scramble
Yeah.
certainly played a role in setting the stage for the Great War.
Wow, that's a mind-blowing realization.
It is.
You know, it shows how seemingly isolated events
Yeah.
can have ripple effects that impact the entire world.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy.
Right.
It's a tapestry of interconnected events,
Yeah.
each one influencing the next in unpredictable ways.
So we've got the technological advancements, the economic motivations, the strategic considerations, the national pride, and now the simmering global tensions.
Yeah.
All contributing to this scramble for Africa.
It's a lot.
What a whirlwind.
Yeah.
But I have to ask,
Yeah.
what about the people of Africa?
Right.
Did they just stand by and watch their continent be carved up
No.
without any resistance?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The idea that Africans passively accepted colonial rule is a dangerous myth.
Okay, good.
In reality, there was widespread resistance,
Okay.
from small-scale acts of defiance to large-scale armed rebellions.
Okay, so let's hear about some of these rebellions.
Okay.
Who were these resistance fighters?
Well, one particularly fascinating example
Okay.
is the Maji Maji Rebellion in German East Africa,
Okay.
which erupted in 1905.
Okay, I'm all ears.
All right, so the Maji Maji Rebellion
Yeah.
was a remarkable display of unity and spiritual resistance.
Okay.
You see, the German colonial authorities had imposed a brutal system
Yeah.
of forced labor and taxation,
Right.
exploiting the local population to cultivate cotton for export.
So it was essentially economic exploitation disguised as progress.
Exactly.
Right.
And the people had reached their breaking point.
Right.
But what makes this rebellion particularly interesting is the role of spiritual beliefs.
Okay.
A charismatic spiritual leader emerged, claiming to possess a magic potion, Maji Maji,
Wow.
that could protect warriors from German bullets.
Wait, so they believed they were literally bulletproof?
Yeah, it's incredible, right?
That's incredible.
It shows the power of belief, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
Yeah, absolutely.
And while the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it
Right.
left an indelible mark on the colonial landscape. The sheer scale of the uprising,
Yeah.
the unity it inspired across different ethnic groups,
Right.
and the brutality of the German response
Wow.
sent shockwaves through the colonial administration.
So even in defeat,
Yeah.
they made a powerful statement about the human desire for freedom and dignity.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The Maji Maji Rebellion is just one example of the countless acts of resistance that took place across Africa during the Scramble.
Wow.
And while these movements might not have achieved their immediate objectives, they planted the seeds for future struggles for independence and self-determination.
It's a reminder that the spirit of resistance is never truly extinguished,
Yeah.
even in the face of overwhelming power.
Beautifully put.
You know, it's like a flame that might flicker,
Yeah.
but never goes out entirely.
And as we move forward in our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll see how these acts of resistance, these sparks of defiance,
Right.
helped pave the way for the eventual dismantling of colonial rule
Okay.
and the emergence of independent African nations.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
We've seen how technological advancements,
Right.
economic ambitions, strategic considerations,
Yeah.
and even notions of national pride fueled the scramble for Africa.
Yeah.
We've explored the brutal realities of colonial exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
the deceptions of King Leopold II,
It's a lot.
the diplomatic maneuvering of the Berlin Conference,
Yeah.
and the inspiring resilience of the Maji Maji Rebellion.
Yeah.
It's been a whirlwind of information and emotions.
It really has. It's a testament to the complexity of this period.
It is.
And as we move forward,
Yeah.
we'll continue to peel back the layers
Okay.
of this historical onion,
All right.
uncovering new insights and
Question.
grappling with the difficult questions it raises.
All right. I'm ready for more.
Good.
Let's continue our deep dive into the heart of the scramble for Africa.
Let's do it. Welcome back. As we continue exploring the scramble for Africa, it's important to understand not just the events, but the ideologies that shaped European actions. It wasn't just about conquering land. It was about imposing a whole way of thinking.
So, beyond the economic and strategic motives, what were the deeper beliefs that drove European colonization? What were they trying to achieve on a cultural level?
One of the most pervasive ideas was this notion of this civilizing mission. Europeans genuinely believed they had a duty to bring their culture, their technology, and let's be honest, their version of civilization to what they considered backward parts of the world.
Whereas like a paternalistic impulse, this idea that they were somehow uplifting the people they were colonizing.
Yeah, that was the narrative they often pushed. But in reality, it was a way to justify their domination and the imposition of their systems of government laws and education, often with little regard for the existing social structures and traditions of African societies.
So they were basically saying, we know what's best for you, even though they were completely disregarding the rich and diverse cultures that already existed in Africa.
Exactly. And this mindset played out in some truly disturbing ways. Take the forced conversion of Africans to Christianity, for example. Missionaries often accompanied colonial expeditions, actively working to undermine traditional African beliefs and practices.
So it wasn't just about spreading the gospel. It was about replacing one set of beliefs with another, often through coercion and pressure. What about the impact on African languages and cultures? Were they actively suppressed?
Absolutely. The imposition of European languages and education systems often led to the marginalization and, in some cases, the outright suppression of indigenous languages and cultural practices. It was a form of cultural imperialism that had lasting consequences.
It's heartbreaking to think about the loss of knowledge, traditions, and cultural identity that occurred during this period.
And this cultural domination wasn't just happening in Africa, it was being showcased back in Europe through these grand colonial exhibitions.
Colonial exhibitions, what were those?
Imagine this. People from colonized territories dressed in traditional attire were put on display in these elaborate exhibitions, almost like human zoos. They were presented as exotic spectacles, reinforcing the idea of European superiority and othering the people they were colonizing.
Hold on, they were putting on a human zoo. That's messed up. It's dehumanizing and exploitative in the most extreme sense.
It's a shocking and disturbing aspect of the scramble. These exhibitions were marketed as educational, but they were really about reinforcing racist stereotypes and justifying colonial rule.
It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained these prejudices were at the time.
And these prejudices weren't just confined to exhibitions, they permeated the entire colonial project, shaping policies and practices on the ground.
So how did these beliefs in European superiority translate into the actual administration of these colonies? How did they govern these vast territories?
Well, they established colonial administrations often staffed by Europeans to govern their African possessions. These administrations were designed to extract resources, maintain control, and enforce European laws and policies.
So they were replicating their own systems of government in Africa without much regard for the existing political structures and traditions.
That's a key observation. And these administrations often relied on a system of indirect rule, utilizing local chiefs and leaders to enforce colonial policies.
So they were co-opting existing power structures to serve their own interests.
Yeah.
That's a clever, albeit manipulative strategy.
Right. It was a way to maintain control with a minimal European presence on the ground. But it also had unintended consequences, sometimes exacerbating existing tensions and rivalries between different groups.
So they were essentially playing puppet master with local politics, potentially sowing the seeds for future conflicts.
Yeah.
What about the economic side of things? How do they exploit the resources of these colonies?
One of the key mechanisms was the establishment of concession companies. These were private businesses granted large tracts of land by colonial governments with the right to exploit the resources of those lands, often with very little oversight or regulation.
So it was like a free-for-all for European businesses to profit from the resources of Africa without having to deal with the messy business of governing.
It was a system ripe for exploitation and abuse. These companies often employed brutal methods, including forced labor violence and intimidation to maximize profits.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It often was. The pursuit of profit, coupled with prevailing racist attitudes, created a system inherently detrimental to the well-being of African people.
But hold on. Didn't the colonial powers bring some positive changes to Africa as well? What about things like infrastructure development, education, and healthcare?
It's true that some infrastructure was developed during the colonial period. Railways were built, roads were constructed, and some hospitals and schools were established. But it's crucial to understand the motivations behind these developments.
So it wasn't entirely altruistic.
The primary goal was often to facilitate the extraction of resources and the consolidation of control, not to benefit the African people. For example, a railway built to transport minerals from a mine to a port might not have done much to improve the lives of people living in villages along the way.
So these improvements often served European interests first and foremost. What about the education systems they introduced? Were they genuinely trying to improve the lives of Africans through education?
The education systems were often designed to train Africans for lower-level positions within the colonial administration, rather than providing them with the skills and knowledge needed for broader social and economic advancement.
So it was more about creating a subservient workforce than about empowering Africans through education.
That's a key takeaway. While some Africans benefited from these educational opportunities, the system as a whole was designed to maintain colonial control.
It's like they were giving just enough to maintain the status quo without actually challenging the power dynamics at play.
Exactly. And this pattern is reflected in many aspects of colonial rule. It wasn't simply about brute force, it was about creating systems and structures that perpetuated European dominance.
Okay, so we've seen how the civilizing mission, colonial administrations, and concession companies all played a role in shaping the realities of life under European rule. But were there any other justifications they used to legitimize their actions?
One of the most insidious was the concept of scientific racism. They distorted scientific theories like Darwinism to argue that Europeans were more evolved and therefore destined to rule over other races.
Wait, so they were twisting science to support their claims of superiority? That's just wrong.
It's a classic example of how science can be manipulated to serve political and ideological agendas. And this pseudo-scientific racism had a profound impact, justifying segregation, discrimination, and the denial of basic rights to African people.
It's a stark reminder that even science, often seen as objective and unbiased, can be used for nefarious purposes.
Another justification employed by colonial powers was the notion of economic development. They argued they were bringing progress and prosperity to Africa through infrastructure projects, investments, and the introduction of new technologies.
But we've already seen how that development was often skewed to benefit European interests.
Exactly. The economic systems they imposed were extractive, designed to siphon wealth out of Africa rather than to build sustainable and equitable economies.
So it was less about altruism and more about enriching themselves at the expense of the people they were claiming to uplift.
Precisely. The rhetoric of economic development often masked a reality of exploitation and inequality. And this exploitation wasn't just economic, it extended to the very fabric of African societies.
All right, we talked earlier about the impact on religion and culture. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? How did the spread of Christianity affect traditional African societies?
Christianity was often presented as a superior religion, and traditional African beliefs were dismissed as primitive, or even pagan missionaries played a key role in this process, often working alongside colonial authorities to undermine traditional religious practices and convert Africans to Christianity.
So it wasn't just about offering a new faith. It was about actively dismantling existing belief systems and replacing them with their own.
And this had a profound impact on African societies. Traditional religious leaders lost influence, and communities were often divided between those who embraced Christianity and those who clung to their traditional beliefs.
It's another example of how the scramble for Africa wasn't just about political and economic control. It was about cultural and spiritual domination as well.
Exactly. Understanding these ideological underpinnings is essential for grasping the full scope and impact of this historical period.
Okay, so we've seen how European powers used a combination of force manipulation and ideology to justify and maintain their control over Africa. It's a pretty bleak picture.
Mm.
But I'm curious to know how these events, these actions, these beliefs ultimately shaped the continent we see today.
Yeah.
How did the scramble for Africa leave its mark on the political, economic, and social landscape of modern-day Africa?
That's a crucial question, and it's one we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive. The legacies of the scramble are complex and multifaceted, affecting everything from national borders to economic systems to social relations. It's a story that continues to unfold even today.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the scramble for Africa. We've explored the motives, the events, the ideologies, and now it's time to confront the lingering question, what happened next? How did this mad dash for African territory shape the continent we see today?
Well, what's fascinating and frankly a bit tragic is how the arbitrary borders drawn during the scramble continue to define the political map of Africa today.
Right.
Like they took a continent, shook it like a snow globe, and let the borders settle wherever they landed, with little regard for the people living there.
It's mind-boggling to think that lines drawn on a map by European powers over a century ago could still have such a profound impact on the lives of millions of people today.
It really is. It's a stark reminder of how the past continues to shape the present. And these artificial boundaries have led to all sorts of problems: ethnic tensions, political instability, even violent conflicts. You suddenly had groups that had historically been rivals or had completely different cultural practices forced together within a single nation state.
So the seeds of conflict were sown right from the start.
Yeah.
It's almost like they set these countries up for failure by ignoring the existing cultural and social dynamics.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the political landscape that was disrupted. The economic systems put in place during colonization continue to cast a long shadow over many African nations.
Right, because the whole colonial enterprise was about extracting resources and enriching European powers, not about building sustainable economies for the people of Africa.
Exactly. Many African economies became dependent on exporting a handful of raw materials to Europe, things like coffee, cocoa minerals.
Right.
This left them vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices with little control over their economic destinies.
So when the price of coffee crashed, their whole economy went down with it. It's
Yeah.
like they were stuck in this endless cycle of extraction and dependence.
It was a recipe for economic instability, and this dependence on raw materials hindered the development of more diversified and resilient economies, making it harder for these newly independent nations to compete in the global marketplace.
So the scramble for Africa didn't just end with independence. Its economic legacy continues to shape the realities of African nations today.
Right.
It's almost like the game was rigged from the start.
And it wasn't just the political and economic spheres that were impacted. The suppression of African languages and cultures during the colonial period had a deep and lasting impact on the social fabric of these societies.
All right, we talked earlier about the civilizing mission and how it led to the imposition of European languages and education systems. But what were the long-term consequences of this cultural domination?
Well, for many Africans, it led to a sense of cultural alienation, a disconnect from their own heritage and traditions.
Right.
They were taught to value European culture above their own, leading to a loss of identity and a sense of inferiority.
So it wasn't just about controlling land and resources. It was about controlling minds and hearts, shaping how people viewed themselves and their place in the world.
Exactly. And this internalized sense of inferiority can have a profound impact on individuals and communities, affecting everything from self-esteem to educational attainment to economic opportunities.
It's a reminder that the wounds of colonialism run deep, affecting not just political and economic structures, but the very soul of a nation.
And those wounds were often compounded by the messy and often chaotic transition to independence. In many cases, European powers left abruptly without adequately preparing African nations for self-rule.
So they were basically saying, okay, you're on your own now, without providing the tools or the support needed to build stable and functioning democracies.
Exactly. And this lack of preparation created a power vacuum that was often filled by authoritarian leaders or military regimes.
So the end of colonialism didn't necessarily lead to freedom and prosperity. In some cases, it simply replaced one form of oppression with another.
And these struggles for power often played out along the very ethnic and regional lines that had been drawn during the scramble. The artificial borders, the unequal distribution of resources, the legacy of divide and rule tactics, all of these factors contributed to a climate of instability and conflict.
It's a tragic irony. The very divisions created by colonialism continue to haunt these newly independent nations long after the colonial powers had departed. But amidst these challenges, there are also stories of resilience, of innovation, of African nations striving to overcome the legacies of the past and chart their own course.
Absolutely. It's important to recognize the agency and determination of African people in shaping their own destinies. There have been significant advancements in education, healthcare, and economic development in many parts of Africa.
And there's a growing movement to reclaim and celebrate African cultures and languages that were suppressed during the colonial era.
It's a vital part of healing and moving forward, rediscovering their heritage, reclaiming their narratives, and shaping a future that honors their unique identities.
So while the legacies of the Scramble for Africa are complex and often challenging, there's also a sense of hope of possibility as African nations continue to write their own stories.
Precisely. The story of Africa is not just a story of colonization and exploitation. It's also a story of resilience, of creativity, of a determination to build a future free from the shackles of the past.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Scramble for Africa. It's been a journey through some of the darkest chapters of human history, but also a testament to the enduring human spirit that seeks freedom, justice, and self-determination. We've seen how a combination of technological advancements, economic ambitions, political rivalries, and misguided ideologies led to the rapid colonization of an entire continent. We've explored the brutal realities of colonial exploitation, the lasting impacts on political and economic systems, and the enduring legacies of cultural suppression. But we've also seen the seeds of resistance, the sparks of defiance, the unwavering determination of African people to fight for their rights and their dignity. And as we conclude this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with a question to ponder. What would the map and the fate of Africa look like today if the scramble had never happened? How would the world be different? A thought-provoking question that invites us to consider the profound and lasting impact of this period in history and to reflect on how we can all contribute to a more just and equitable future.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. Our